here today? Well, this is something that you guys can all do at home to practice what we're going to learn here today. All right, now you can do this on any camera that will allow you to do manual mode. As you can see on the screen, my camera is now set to manual mode, and for the ideal picture and exposure, we're looking to try and get 100 ISO. For this particular shot, I'm using an f1.8 and a shutter speed of 1/40th of a second. This is supposed to give me the correct exposure for this photograph. Okay, so we've taken that picture now, and what I'm going to do now is show you what will happen if I allow the camera to make some choices for me. I'm going to put the camera now onto aperture priority. If you have a look here, this M will change to an A. There we go. Now what this actually does is allow me to choose the aperture setting, which as you can see is still at 1.8. We'll talk a little bit more about aperture later on in this tutorial. But as you also can see, the ISO jumped up to 1600. The camera made a choice also of my shutter speed, 1/640th of a second. So we're going to get a much faster shutter speed. We have a lot of light coming into the camera with an f1.8, but the sensitivity has increased to 1600 to get the same exposure. So I will take another picture. There we go.
Hello, okay. Let's take a quick look at these two photographs that we just shot. One was on manual mode where I made all the settings, the ISO settings, the shutter speed, and also the f-stop of 1.8. In the second image it was all automatic except for the aperture, which I kept at 1.8. As you can see, it changed the shutter speed and it changed the ISO. When you compare the two pictures side by side, we'll just take a look over here, you can see that they are identical, absolutely identical. If you look at the histogram here, it's ISO 100, 50mm, 1.8 at 1/40th of a second. The histogram is nicely balanced with a lot of data here in the middle. If we go over to the where the camera shows the shutter speed and the ISO, we see the histogram here is a lot of data. ISO now 1600, 1.8 still, and 164th of a second. So the shutter is much faster. The sensitivity has increased. Sensitivity is increased. Maybe there's more grain. Let's have a look. Okay, let's take this picture here. This is shot at 1/40th, an ISO of 100. Now we zoom into this little bit here, and hopefully you can see on your screens that there's virtually no noise. And it's very, very sharp. There we go. Look into this area here. And yeah, nope, it looks great. Looks fine. This is ISO 100. Now if we compare it to the other photograph that was taken, where the ISO is 1600, and if we look very carefully into these dark areas here, hopefully you can see this on your screen, you'll see a lot of pixel breakup and a lot of noise. Now 1600 isn't high sensitivity, and it's usually okay. There we go. You see all the noise? See the difference? So if possible, it's always better to shoot in the lowest possible ISO that you can. That's your goal when you take photographs. Look over here. Look at the grain. Let's quickly go back to the first one again, so that you can see. See, we've zoomed in. No noise. Beautiful. ISO 100.
Okay, I've reset my camera back to manual mode. So I have chosen 1/40th of a second shutter speed, aperture of 1.8, and an ideal ISO of 100. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about ISO in another tutorial. Now we're going to see what happens when I adjust my f-stop manually. F2, my ISO increased to 125. My shutter speed will remain the same because I'm not adjusting it, as I am on manual mode. But you'll see the ISO increasing. 2.2, 2.8, 3.2, and so forth. As you watch me increase the f-stop, you see my ISO increases. So I'll now focus on this and take another picture so that we can compare it with the photograph that we took at 1.8 f-stop.
Hello, and let's take a quick look at the original photograph that we took in manual mode on f1.8. As you can see, we have bokeh or blurring. So our field of focus or depth of field is very shallow. What's at the back of our subjects and at the front of our subjects will be out of focus, but our subject itself will be nice and sharp. If you have a look over here on the second photograph, which is now at f8.0, our depth of field has increased, so we can now see more of what's at the back of our subject, and consequently we'll also be able to see more of what is in front of our subject. Of course, our subject is nice and sharp. I hope this is making it a little bit more clear of exactly what your f-stop is doing, your aperture.
Okay, as you can see again, I have now put my camera back to manual mode. It's still a manual mode. It's 1/40th. Back down to an f-stop of 1.8, and of course my ISO is 100. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to increase the shutter speed. As I do this, watch the ISO. It's also beginning to increase. Okay. Okay, what we're going to do now is to show you what happens when you actually add light to your subject. It's now at 1/50th of a second. My f-stop is 1.8. My ISO is 100. Now if you look here, this is my exposure. Darker to the left on my camera and brighter to the right. I'm going to add some light to my subject. Did you notice the exposure increase here? So to get the ideal exposure at 100 ISO, we will either have to increase our shutter speed or change our f-stop setting to a higher number, which means a smaller aperture. Let's see what happens. I'll increase my shutter speed first. Notice the exposure has gone down to in the middle here at 1/100th of a second, 1/25th of a second, but we kept an f of 1.8. Let's take that picture so we can compare it. Now let me take the camera back down to a 50th of a second. We'll see that we're really overexposed here. Let's increase the light a bit more. Now we're really overexposed for this photograph. So we'll increase the shutter speed to compensate. 1/25th, and it's kind of still overexposed at 1/25th with my extra light. So I can increase my shutter speed. Let's take a picture. Okay, what we'll do now is we'll keep the light the way it is, and I will bring my shutter speed back down to 1/50th. We have an overexposed photograph at this time. So let's play with the f-stop, our aperture. Again, watching our exposure change. For a correctly exposed photograph, with the amount of light that we have, we've changed our f-stop from 1.8 to 3.5. This will give us a correctly exposed photograph. Let's take a picture so we can compare it. As you can see, we've got a slightly overexposed photograph here again. So we can increase our shutter speed, and it goes away. Or we can make our aperture smaller, so f4, to make the exposure correct for this photograph. What we've done here is we've played with our shutter speed and f-stop settings to give us a correctly exposed photograph, but keeping our ISO at 100, which is ideal, minimum amount of noise, and no grain. Shooting at ISO 100 or 200 is the ideal wherever possible. And to do this, you can adjust your f-stop settings and your shutter speeds.
Well, here we are again in Lightroom to compare those three photographs we've just taken. The first photograph here is taken at ISO 100, f1.8 at 1/25th of a second, using the light to help our exposure. As you can see from the histogram, there's plenty of data in the midtones. Second photograph, same light, also ISO 100 at f1.8 at 160th of a second. Both photographs look fine and nicely exposed. A little bit of blurring in the background due to the f1.8. The third photograph, to compensate for the light, still at ISO 100, but our f-stop now is 3.5 at 1/50th of a second. So for the light that we had, we adjusted our f-stop to get a correctly exposed photograph. As you can see, the chair is a little more in focus now at f3.5, and you can almost read the label on this bottle.
As you can see, my camera is set to manual mode. I have 1/25 of a second with an f setting of 1.8. My ISO is 100, but I'm underexposed. I don't have any extra light to light my subject. I want to keep my 1/25 of a second, and I want to keep my f of 1.8. So, how can I get a correctly exposed photograph? By increasing the number on my ISO. As you can see, I'm beginning to get a correctly exposed photograph. An ISO of 320 will allow me to take a correctly exposed photograph without any extra light. Now this is okay. At 320 ISO is fine. So you don't always need to have lights. With a digital camera, you can get a correctly exposed photograph by increasing your ISO. Let's take a picture so we can compare it. So what have we actually discussed here today? By manipulating the three options on our digital camera, shutter speed, aperture settings, ISO, we can correctly expose a photograph. If we want to be creative and have an f setting of 1.8, blurring out the background, we can do this, but keep a correctly exposed picture by adjusting our shutter speed or ISO. We can also add extra light to our subject should we want to correctly expose our photograph, and keep our f-stop setting, our shutter speed, and our chosen ISO. Okay, what I'd like to talk about now is depth of field or field of focus. Both are exactly the same thing. What do we mean by field of focus, depth of field? Well, first of all, it's adjusted by our f-stop setting. Our aperture. Aperture. What is aperture? It's what we use to be creative when taking our photographs. If we were to use an f-stop of 1.8, like I have here, we would get a blurred out background. If I was to increase it to 5.6 or 8, the background would be more in focus. This is our depth of field. How much of our subject is in focus? When we focus on our subject, we expect that to be sharp. But our f-stop setting will determine what is in focus and what is out of focus, both in front of the subject and behind it. An f1.8 will give a field of focus, or also known as a depth of field, and make it more shallow. How is an f-stop setting created? Well, it's a fraction. An f-stop setting, focal length of your camera, divided by the diameter of the hole that opens and closes to allow light to hit your sensor. It's a fraction, which is why a 1.8 ends up being a larger diameter. For example, my 50mm lens here, if I was to change the hole that allows the light to hit the sensor to a diameter of 25mm, 50mm divided by 25mm gives me 2, an f-stop of 2. It's a fraction, which is why the bigger the hole, the smaller the number. Well, that's the confusing part. But try to remember that when you look at a subject and it's very, very, very bright, you squint at the subject. So you're kind of like trying to reduce the amount of light that's going into your pupil. And if you look at a pupil at night, you'll see that it's dilated much larger. So it's trying to get as much light as possible. So it kind of works in the same way as your eye. Okay, so let's take a picture here at 1/25th of a second, f1.8, my ISO at 320. I'm not using any extra light for this, but I see that I'm slightly underexposed, which is okay. So we'll change it to an ISO of 400. We'll focus on the subject right in front, as you can see the green square here, and we'll take a picture. If you look at the picture, you see you cannot read the writing on the, well, it's a Bellini bottle. It's not very clear. But our little Christmas decoration here is sharp as a pin. This is your field of focus, or depth of field. What's behind the subject that you focused on is a little out of focus, and consequently what's in front of the subject that you've just photographed will also be a little out of focus on an f-stop of 1.8, which, if you remember, is a very large diameter opening, allowing a lot of light to hit your sensor. Now what we're going to do now is I'm going to move my little red square here, my focus, over to my Bellini bottle and focus on that. Now we can actually read the writing on this Bellini bottle. Let's take a picture. We haven't changed any of the settings, 1/25th, f1.8. My ISO is still 400, but it's showing me as being very overexposed on this case. Well, there's a lot of reflection coming off that bottle, so I'm going to have to adjust my ISO so that I don't get a blown out photograph. So let's reduce the sensitivity of my ISO. And you see my exposure is dropping nicely to correctly exposed shot. Let's take that picture so we can compare it. My f-stop is still 1.8, my Bellini bottle is nice and sharp, but as you can see, my Christmas decoration here now is out of focus. This is what you'll have to consider if you were to take photographs of a group of people, for example, or even two people if they're slightly, well, if they're not quite sitting next to each other. One or the other of the subject, depending which one you focused on, will be out of focus. So to change that, we have to increase our f-stop to 5.6 or 8. Large groups of people, maybe an f11. Again, this makes the aperture smaller, reducing the amount of light that will hit your sensor. But it increases the field of view, field of focus, depth of field. Strike the field of view, that's not correct. By increasing your f-stop setting, you will be able to increase your depth of field. Let's demonstrate this. I'm going to increase my f-stop setting to 11. You see we're underexposed now because the aperture has got a lot smaller, so less light is able to hit our sensor. So what can we do to fix this? Well, we can change our shutter speed, or we can change our ISO. Let's have a look and see what happens if we change the shutter speed. Now, if we want to allow more light in to our sensor because we are underexposed, we're going to have to slow down our shutter speed. As you can see, the shutter speed is now dropping right down to, pretty slow. Let's focus again on this bottle. Take a picture so we can compare the two side by side, one taken at f11 and the previous one at f1.8. Ooh, did you notice how slow the shutter was? Shutter had to open for a lot longer to allow enough light that had to get through that very small aperture, f11, to hit our sensor. But did you notice that our Christmas decoration is also in focus? Let's focus on our Christmas decoration at f11. Now we're underexposed by focusing on that. Okay, so what can we do? That means there's not enough light hitting the sensor now. Okay, so we're going to have to keep slowing down the shutter. The shutter is now going to be open for 1 second just to take a correctly exposed photograph at f11. Let's take a picture to compare. Wow. Okay, f11, 1 second, ISO of 125. Now let's see if we add some light. Now we're overexposed. So what can we do about that? I'd still like to keep f11. So if we have too much light, we'll need to speed up the shutter or reduce the sensitivity of our ISO. I like an ISO of 125. Less noise and will give us a nice picture. So let's increase our shutter speed and watch our exposure coming down at the same time. Now at f11, 1/6 of a second, we can take a picture and get a correctly exposed photograph. As you heard there, shutter speed was a little faster. Now what if there was a little bit of movement on this subject? Still life, not likely. However, there might be some movement. So how do we make sure that we don't get any blur? I'd like to keep my ISO of 125. I'd like to keep my f-stop at f11. So how do we stop blur? Well, at a 50mm lens, I'm going to need to take a picture at least 1/50th of a second. If it was a 300mm lens, I would need to take a picture of at least or over 1/300th of a second. I'll explain a bit more about that later. So let's increase our shutter speed to something that will freeze any movement. 1/60th will do it at a 50mm lens, but I'm now underexposed. My aperture is too small. The hole is too small. So what can we do to fix that? Well, we could change the aperture, but I don't want to do that. That only leaves me an option of adjusting my ISO. Because if I increase my shutter speed, things are just going to get worse. So let's adjust the ISO and make it more sensitive. Oh, well, 1250 ISO, that's okay to take a photograph at f11 at 1/60th. That will freeze any movement that's going on. Unfortunately, I can't get any of these subjects to move, but we'll take a picture anyway, just to show you. Okay.
Well, here we are again in the Lightroom, and here's the first photograph that we took at ISO 125 f11 and shutter speed of 1 second. It's a nice photograph. Everything's in focus here. The Christmas decoration, the Bellini bottle, the chair in the background, this cabinet also. We can even see what's going on in the back here. Second photograph here, you can see, is 1/6 of a second, still on f11 with a nice ISO 125. It's a little darker here in the background. Faster shutter speed did that. Okay, the third photograph, 1/60th of a second, but our ISO has increased to 1250. So we're going to get a little bit more grain, a little bit more noise, but it's still a good photograph.
Well guys, I'd just like you to go and get your cameras now and see if you can set up something very similar to what we have here. I'm going to change my camera to aperture. As you see, an A is here now. That means I get to choose the aperture, but the camera will take care of my shutter speed. At the moment, as you can see, my ISO, I'm able to also take care of that at the same time. If your camera is able to change to an automatic ISO, like you can see here, then that's one less thing for you to think about. Now all you need to concentrate on is the creativity. What do you want to do? Do you want to blur the backgrounds, have a shallow depth of field, or do you want everything to be pin sharp? So if I adjust my f-stop to 1.8 so that I have a nice bokeh in the background, the camera has picked a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. The ISO has chosen a sensitivity of 1/50. This will give me the correctly exposed photograph. All I need to focus on is which aperture I'd like to take my photograph with. Go ahead and practice with your camera and take hundreds of photographs at different aperture settings, allowing your camera to take care of its own shutter speed and ISO, and compare those photographs. This is the only way to learn. Let's take a picture so we can compare it. I'm also going to focus on the Bellini bottle. Let's focus on that. The camera is still happy with an ISO of 1250 and a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. We'll take a picture so that we can compare the two.
Okay, one more stop in Lightroom here to compare those last two photographs that we've taken. The first one here on the left is focused on the Christmas decorations. You can see it's nice and sharp, but our Bellini bottle here is a little blurred. That's our depth of field, very shallow at 1.8. The second photograph here, as you can see, the Bellini bottle is nice and sharp as I focused on that, but our Christmas decoration is out of focus. Shallow depth of field, f1.8. Well, I hope that's made it clearer what an aperture actually does to make your photographs a little bit more creative and interesting to look at. Go out there and snap as many photographs as you can, and change your f-stop settings, play around with your shutter speeds, your ISOs, different lighting conditions. You've just got to take thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. Compare them as you go by and as you go along. See the differences. Eventually it'll become second nature to you and you won't even think about it. So you can then concentrate on the creativity and make some beautiful